Hai sahabat iklim, jumpa lagi dengan KLIMATalk edisi expert. Hari ini kita kedatangan tamu luar biasa. Dia adalah Motsumi Malecane, seorang team leader dari Least Developed Countries di unit di dalam UNFCCC. Hello, good afternoon, Motsumi.
Good afternoon, Siswanto.
Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you indeed.
Yeah. So we are now in KLIMATalk podcast by BMKG. So here we publish some application and inform people about the climate change and related hazards, something like that. So we are very happy to have you here. And as we know that you are a team leader, least developed countries unit of UNFCCC. Can you explain briefly about your role and the team that you are working with?
Yeah, thank you very much for that good question. Actually, the UNFCCC is one of the several institutions under the UN that has a specific focus to the least developed countries. And with that, back then in the years in 2001, there was an LDC work program that was established. This has been followed by many developments, primarily on adaptation. Okay. So my work entails supporting the least developed countries technically and with advice and guidance. There is an expert group that is established that supports them, but also now also looking after the intergovernmental support on national adaptation plans, which are also the primary instruments for adaptation under the UNFCCC.
Okay, great. How many countries actually in the world that included in the LCDs?
There are currently 46.
46 countries.
Yes, across the globe.
Now we come to the question regarding the climate change. In Article 7, it is written in the Paris Agreement that parties should strengthen their cooperation on enhancing action on adaptation, taking into account the Cancun adaptation framework, including with regard to strengthening scientific knowledge on climate, including research, systematic observation, and then the climate system and early warning system in a manner that inform climate service and support decision making. Commenting on this statement written in the Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, how can we ensure that climate science information collected and produced at national level effectively influence both national and international climate policies, and how it goes to the process like COP and etc.?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. And actually, let me primarily speak in the context of the national adaptation plans, which you just asked me about, which I think are also relevant for the workshop that we are in the context here when we are discussing about adaptation. And of course, this is notwithstanding that under the UNFCCC, there are other many ways in which this is manifested in how we ensure that the scientific information and knowledge informs policy decisions both locally, nationally, as well as at the intergovernmental level. But now coming down to the national adaptation plans, as I was saying, and adaptation actually, we know that adaptation in all its forms, whether we are talking about understanding the problem, and also setting the national, for instance, vision and goals in terms of what the country wants to do to address the problem, in terms of risk and vulnerability assessment to understand deeper from the scientific perspective, and also implementation of actions that would address the risks that we see, to the monitoring and evaluation. All that requires support, must be supported by the best available science, as we would usually call it. And that also includes the knowledge of indigenous peoples. We shouldn't forget that.
Yeah, indigenous people.
Exactly, and values and knowledge systems. And the local knowledge, they are very key. But all that knowledge helps us to better frame the problem and be able to address adaptation more effectively. In fact, this is the guiding principle for adaptation under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. When we talk about adaptation, you cannot do it without considering the best available science and the existing knowledge systems. Secondly, we are nearly 3 decades since the establishment of the UNFCCC itself.
It's already 30 years, right?
Exactly. And it is now a universal fact that climate change is affecting or impacting every aspect of our life, whether it's natural systems, our economies, which is actually becoming obvious, but also life, which is, I think, the most important thing as we consider. And that climate change adaptation in itself is a development imperative. We can no longer assume we can do our well-being climate development without considering climate. Yes, and now I think what is important for us now with this context is that is how do we then, it's no longer about whether the climate is happening, but then we should be asking to what degree is that climate impacting on our systems? So to what degree is the climate impacting our potential to produce adequate food? To what degree is it impacting provision of water, for instance? And to what degree does it impose disasters that somehow tend to claim lives and destroy infrastructure and property? And in order to understand this magnitude and nature of the problem itself, indeed, definitely, we cannot do it without considering the climate science. And this informs both the policy, as I said, from the national level, what governments do, but also at the regional levels on how do we cooperate to address it. Because climate change, as you know, it crosses borders. It doesn't have political borders like we do in our administrations and many other things. The same when a tropical cyclone comes, I don't know if you have tropical cyclones in Indonesia, for instance, but when it comes, it sweeps everywhere. It doesn't choose that, okay, we'll hit Indonesia here and avoid, it sweeps everything along the way. So regional and international cooperation is important here. And we need to have precise information to be able to answer these questions, which now actually very briefly brings me to the actions that we need to be taking. As you rightfully say, that then how do we make sure that the information that we have locally trickles all the way up to the international systems? So at the national level, we should have systems that are able to collect the data, and we should be able to analyze, compile the data and process it, and be able to disseminate it, because having the data is one thing, but we should be able to disseminate it and let it be used by people to generate the awareness and the impact we want, because without it being used, then it doesn't have impact. At the same time, we also need to be able to use that data to assess the vulnerabilities. Because I was very impressed. We were taken for a tour on Monday on the beautiful systems that you have here, both for tsunami, earthquakes, for early warning systems, the climate monitoring and advisory. I found this to be this is actually the foundation that we said every country needs to be having these systems in place to be able to inform the national systems very well. And once we have these systems, then it helps actually the society and the government to identify the appropriate measures to take, whether we should do something about it, run away, or if we can't do something about it. So, but it helps us to come up with the most appropriate measures. If we are saying we are having a deficit in rainfall, is it really a problem? Should we worry about it? Or is it just a small deficit that we can still survive? But if it's significant, then obviously we need to do something. And depending on the magnitude, if it's bigger, for instance, sometimes it might even say we need to stop cropping certain type of crops. And indeed, the national adaptation plans, as I initially said, provide us a platform to do justice. You have the national adaptation plans that help countries do the framing of the understanding of the problem and what information you need, and then from there what you need to do. So thank you very much. I hope I've answered the question. And also the last part that maybe needs still your comment on that, how to bring all of them into the international process like COP, that every year we have that COP of UNFCCC. Actually, in adaptation, what is most important, what countries are always encouraged to do, is to come up with their national adaptation plans. They don't only identify what you need to do, but they also identify the climate risks that the country is facing. And those climate risks or the climate change that is happening at the national level will be informed by the observations that you have. So this strengthens actually the realization of the problem problem, even at the international level. So countries through such documents are able to communicate to the international level, which then comes into the COP and then comes to the realization that, yes, indeed, we do have serious problems. And in fact, and this is the beauty of it, because it follows that country determination. A country has to do their own assessment and see to what degree are they vulnerable, so that then when we discuss at the international space and see what level of challenge are we faced with and what kind of support is needed to support the countries, that information is crucial for that purpose. Because without it, it will be very difficult, even for the COP or for parties at the COP setting, to start to make decisions that we want to enable this level of funding or this level of technological support, because it will not be based on existing scientific knowledge. Of course, right now we already know from the higher level perspective that climate change is happening. That one is a fact. At the macro level we know. But then the granularity of what level of the challenge, how big is it? So what level of ambition do we need to make? This information is crucial to provide evidence for that level of ambition that is required.
So that information should be showed in a clear image,
exactly.
Clear image, and then so then in the international level, for example, like COP, people can just clearly see and solve the problem at the root.
It's summarized in different ways, because it will get synthesized. The more countries make this information available, there are ways in which this is captured in the UNFCCC context, but also countries or other studies that are done more deeper in scientific standing also provide ways on how this information can be used. So the observations we make at the national level actually end up informing the global policy. For instance, right now I'll talk about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which actually does the synthesis of the existing and available science. That is also based on what we do. The simple measurements that your observers do at the station do a big impact in terms of how they inform all the subsequent compilations that we have at a global level, because it's that simple observation that is combined with all other existing data sets that are able to give us a good picture. So every person that is making observations across the world, no matter how insignificant you may think that is, the impact is very big, because that forms part of the bigger data sets that then we use to make these big policy decisions.
The last question, we all know that developing countries, particularly the least developed countries, also the small island developing countries, are most vulnerable to the climate change impact. How does the UNFCCC in this issue play a role in supporting these countries to successfully adapt and to mitigate the climate change?
Exactly the point. I think that's a good point as well you're raising there. The UNFCCC itself, as an intergovernmental process, brings together all countries or all governments, and it provides a platform for the developed nations to actually provide funding and technological support to the developing countries, and particularly the groups you are mentioning about, the least developed countries, small island developing states. I prioritize set of countries that we know that they are facing more challenges than the rest of the world. And indeed, the climate change or the UNFCCC process creates that platform already for governments to have, and it sets obligations for that. We have, of course, you do know that we have the Paris Agreement, the legal framework, and of course the convention as well as the legal treaty there that provides for obligations for the developed nations to provide support to the least able ones. This includes supporting countries in the full cycle of addressing climate challenges, right from the observations, to strengthen the observations and the knowledge and the information, the climate information science and basis that we need in order to be able to prove and to understand to what extent is climate change affecting our systems, all the way to planning on what needs to be done, involving the governments to make the right decisions, to the implementation and to the monitoring and evaluation. The support is there through the full cycle for countries. And I'll just mention just a few in terms of when we come back, for instance, specifically to adaptation. Governments also sit together and agree on a set of guidelines. And guidelines are useful because we follow sort of a common methodology and approach to how we do adaptation, which helps also in the international system, such that we know that when a country has produced, for instance, a plan or a national adaptation plan, this is consistent and is country-driven and follows certain principles that countries have agreed at the COP level, that these are the guiding principles by which we should be doing the adaptation properly. So there are guidelines that the Conference of the Parties puts forward, and we are currently following and using those. Then there's the technical support that is extended to these countries. For instance, particularly for the least developed countries, there's a least developed countries expert group. So this group now draws from the guidelines created by the COP, then creates training and capacity development for the LDCs and brings them together and walks the way with them, handholds them into preparing plans, into accessing support. Of course, it serves also as a body that brokers what others can support, because under the UNFCCC there's a lot of other people that will support. There are regional centers, there are networks, etc. So it also serves as the brokering. And there are other bodies as well. And then we have the Adaptation Committee that works more at the international level, at the intergovernmental level, to ensure coherence of the support that's being provided by the many different actors. We also have the UN and other international organizations. In fact, in this workshop, you've seen how many organizations are here. This also happens within the auspices of the UNFCCC as well, because there is a direct invitation to many of the UN organizations, regional centers and networks to provide assistance or support to the developing countries in undertaking their climate actions. There is also financial support. You know, everybody knows now the Green Climate Fund. The biggest climate fund, So this is established under the UNFCCC, which is to primarily support the climate actions of the developing countries. With contributions, of course, from the most able and many other sources. And also we have the Adaptation Fund, which has been there for quite a long time now, that also still remains a strong pillar and support for adaptation actions of the developing countries. The least developed countries themselves actually have a specific fund for them. It's called the LDC Fund.
LDC Fund.
Or the Least Developed Countries Fund. It's managed by the Global Environment Facility. It has been very instrumental in helping, because the LDCs, as they are, I would argue that they are champions or pioneers of adaptation, because they've been doing this for the past 22 years, since 2001 when their work program was established. So they've been doing this with support from the Least Developed Countries Fund, and of course there's also the Special Climate Change Fund that is also for the rest of the developing countries. There is a framework for capacity building under the UNFCCC. We also have the technology mechanism. And all these groups that you mentioned are given priority in terms of accessing this support, whether it's capacity building support, access to climate-friendly technologies or adaptation technologies. So this is the support that the UNFCCC provides, the framing. And in fact, I would also take this advantage to say that even ourselves as the Secretariat, at the Secretariat level, our Executive Secretary is taking this very seriously, because he has made a pledge to ensure that all the least developed countries and all small island developing states have a planning instrument, the NAP that I talk about, because it will help them to have a more comprehensive process towards their adaptation planning, or towards how they address and achieve successful adaptation. And also not only to have the plan, what is most important actually is to implement. The plan. Priorities you identified in that plan. So he's made a strong pledge to see how the UN system and the whole international system can come together to accelerate the pace at which support is being provided to these countries. So it's a key instrument. Overall, as I say, the idea is to help these countries to achieve successful adaptation to climate change.
That actually the intended workshop that we held right now in BMKG, supported by the Green Climate Fund, as well as the all international bodies and organizations.
Yes, indeed.
I hope that our workshop will have a fruitful workshop and succeed in the target and goals. And we hope that all the climate action that has been planned by each country technically supported by the all organization can be implemented in home country.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Motsumi, for your coming.
Okay.
Demikian tadi perbincangan kita dengan Motsumi dari UNFCCC, expert dari UNFCCC. Semoga tadi menambah pengetahuan kita bagaimana aksi iklim yang dilakukan oleh setiap negara itu bisa direncanakan dengan baik, yang mendapatkan bantuan support dari lembaga-lembaga internasional yang berada di dalam, salah satunya adalah dalam workshop Climate Information for Climate Action yang diselenggarakan BMKG bekerjasama dengan WMO dan GCF ini. Thank you very much, Motsumi, for your coming, and I hope that you enjoy your time in Indonesia.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.